So here's another fact. Despite increasing carbon emissions, the planet continues to both warm and cool. And here's an example of this. This is a chart that shows, this is carbon dioxide. That line going up there is the carbon dioxide. No question, it's going up, almost like an escalator. But look at the actual behavior of the temperature record over that time. Up, down, up, down, up, down. This is 1998 when they had a huge El Nino warming. And then it goes back again. And you notice in the last few years, the temperature trend has been more down. But the point I'm trying to make here is, does it really look like carbon dioxide all by itself is the principal cause of all of this when there's so much up and down warming? Look at how cool it was in 1985, for example. Why isn't carbon dioxide keeping it warmer? Clearly, there must be other factors at operation, apart from carbon dioxide, to have created this kind of changing warming and cooling. So the inconvenient question is, how can humanity's carbon emissions be the principal cause of warming when warming hasn't occurred in at least a decade? Clearly other factors, and the other two factors are the sun and the oceans, are more powerful. The reason that the planet hasn't warmed in the last decade is because we've gone through a low sunspot cycle. And when there's low sunspot cycles, it means the sun's intensity is not as strong, and the oceans are going into one of their periodic cooling phases, something called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, moving into cooling. It warms, it cools, it warms, it cools. Right now it's gone into cooling, so the planet's cooling. Sun, oceans, not human carbon emissions running the show. Fear. Alarmists give the impression that further CO2 emissions will cause accelerated warming. Here's the facts. Earth's temperature reacts strongly to small changes in CO2 values at the lower end of the range, less than 200 parts per million, but changes much less at the high end of the range, that's 800 parts per million. That's from a fellow called William Rudiman, who is very strongly on the alarmist side on all of this. But nonetheless, what he's saying, and it's from a textbook, it's not me saying this, not a skeptic, he's not a skeptic at all. But one of the things he's saying is that the more carbon dioxide you add, the less effect it has per unit. So extra carbon dioxide is not going to cause accelerated warming. Warming is going to fall. Now watch. So let's do the math, or better still, the physics. The planet's temperature increased by 0.6 degrees Celsius in the 20th century. Carbon dioxide concentrations rose in that century 80 parts per million. Up to now, what is 370 parts per million. So I'm going to show you a little table that shows the amount of warming that this is going to produce. And here it is. So we got 700, we've added 0.6 degrees Celsius. The cumulative increase at this point, this is at the end of the 20th century, 0.6. That's what we were just talking about. Now, let's say that we add another 80 parts per million. To make it 450 parts per million, the temperature increase is half. It's a logarithmic scale. So if 80 parts per million produces 0.6 degrees Celsius of warming, the next 80 will produce 0.3. Any of you have ever studied that story about the chessboard where you put 1 grain of wheat on a chessboard and then you double it each time? And pretty soon you end up with more pieces of wheat than there are stars in the universe, or molecules. You'll get the way that this works in reverse. Each time we add 80 parts per million of carbon dioxide, the amount of warming decreases. And as you can see, it goes down to, when you get to 560 parts per million added, 850, more or less double what we've got now, you end up with warming that is almost imperceptible. And ultimately what you really end up with, this could go on, and it would go 1.2, 1.21, 1.22, but it's really not warming very much. Probably not going to go much more than 1.2 degrees Celsius. Not exactly the overwhelming warming that we've been told will happen. Here's a little chart that shows the warming effect. This is temperature. This is parts per million. As you can see, you get most of your warming from the first 20, 30, 40, 50 parts per million of carbon dioxide. After that, the amount of warming falls. So we can put tons of carbon dioxide up there, and chances are the warming is not going to be that great. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change completely discounts this. But any time that you take a look at the research on carbon dioxide, you'll see that there is such a thing as carbon dioxide saturation. They don't mention it, by the way, because it doesn't fit the theory. All right. Inconvenient warming fact number 3, fear the world is heading toward oblivion if it warms an additional 2 degrees Celsius or if CO2 levels double. So, here's the President of the United Nations speaking at the Bali Conference on Climate in 2007, Ban Ki-moon. Here's what he says: "We are at a crossroads. One path leads to a comprehensive climate change agreement." They were aiming for, what was it called, Copenhagen or Kyoto at that point? I don't know, I forget now. "And the other one leads to oblivion." So we got 2 choices. We can either choke our carbon economy to death, or we can choke to death. Those are our choices, oblivion. Now, any journalist, any sensible journalist, any sensible human being should be looking at this and saying, wow, that's a really extreme claim. Let's examine it more closely. Well, hardly anybody did, but I did. And here's what you discover when you look at what happens when the temperature goes up 2 degrees Celsius or carbon dioxide doubles. Fact: for most of the history of multicellular life in this planet, in other words, since there's been beings that are smaller or bigger than one single cells, that's like for the last 600 million years, for 90% of that time, the planet has been warmer, and often much warmer, and CO2 levels have been much, much higher, up to 20 times higher than today's levels. Fact: these fears of oblivion are politically, not scientifically based. And yet, no alarmist climate scientist at that conference in Bali stood up and said, "Mr. Ban Ki-moon, you've got to be wrong. This can't be right." Because in the past, we had CO2 levels much higher than this, and we had temperatures, 10, 12, 15 degrees Celsius higher than today. And yet, for some strange reason, dinosaurs and mammals evolved, thrived, and survived. So we're not going to have oblivion. It's a complete lie. And yet, for some strange reason, it's taken seriously. This is one of the key points when I realized that there was something seriously wrong with climate science and the way it's being presented to the public, because I realized that statement makes no sense at all. Here's a record of the temperature over the last 600 million years, and I hope you can read it. But what you have here, if I can get my little thing working, this is carbon dioxide, the black line, if you can see it. You can see that it's very, very high in the far distant past, 600 million years ago. 250 odd million years ago, we had our last major ice age. And it was also a time of a major extinction. It's called the Permian-Triassic extinction. About 90 to 95% of all critters on the planet died, were eliminated at this point. And then carbon dioxide went up a bit, warming went up quite a bit warmer. There's the warming. Went down, went up. There's carbon dioxide going down. There's the temperatures. But notice how carbon dioxide goes down, but the temperature sort of stays up until about 50 million years ago. At that point, we start to get a precipitous fall in temperature, similar to the precipitous fall in temperature that occurred 250 million years ago. This should scare us. What we have to fear at this point, if this chart makes any sense at all, is not warming, but another one of these ice ages. And this was a brutal one. 90 to 95% of creatures extinguished during that cooling period. I also want you to notice that, the age of dinosaurs and the age of mammals, so look at the temperatures, way, way higher than today. Look at the levels of carbon dioxide, way higher than today. So to worry about an increase of 2 degrees Celsius in temperature and 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide is frankly ridiculous. The planet is in an ice age. It's been in an ice age for the last 2 million years. Our geological era is the coldest it's been in 250 million years. And we're worried about warming. Here's a comment from John and Mary Gribben, a little book called Ice Age. One of the first books I read on this topic, and it galvanized me, I must confess. By the standards of the geological past, we live in an ice age. The world has rarely been as cold as it is today. I read that and I thought, wait a minute, and we're worrying about warming? Wow. This is what's been happening over the last 50 million years. There was a huge release of methane about 55 million years ago. Big problem.